Continuamos en el segundo foro internacional La innovación en la justicia, organizado por México Evalúa y la Fundación Friedrich Naumann para la Libertad. Les invitamos a interactuar, compartirnos sus comentarios, sus preguntas a través del sitio oficial del foro innovacionenlajusticia.mexicoevalúa.org y a través de las redes oficiales de México Evalúa en Facebook, Twitter, Instagram y YouTube, utilizando el hashtag Innovando la Justicia. Vamos a continuar las actividades del día de hoy con el siguiente panel, denominado Justicia Climática, la responsabilidad de los tribunales. Este panel estará moderado por Anaid Velasco, gerenta de investigación del Centro Mexicano de Derecho Ambiental, CEMDA. Participarán Celeste Gabriela Cedillo González, catedrática de la Universidad de las Américas en Puebla, Gabriela Renata Terrazas Tapia, vicepresidenta de Oceana México, y Froilán Hernández Ruiz, Senior Attorney de The Nature Conservancy. Los temas que se abordarán serán justicia ambiental, ética y política, discriminaciones de comunidades dependientes de recursos naturales, así como procuración e impartición de justicia ante delitos ambientales. Le cedemos la palabra a Anaid Velasco.
Now we give the floor to Anaid Velasco. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel on environmental justice. As I'm going to introduce our guest today, Dr. Gabriela Celeste Cedillo González. She is doctor in political sciences by the National University in Mexico, and her main lines of research are environmental geography and the policies of observation in Mexico, as well as the environmental governance and preservation applied to the concepts of criminal justice and natural resources. She is a full-time professor and researcher in the Department of International Affairs and Political Sciences in the University of Americas in Puebla. Welcome, Celeste. And we also have Froilán Hernández Ruiz. Froilán is a lawyer by CIDE. He has a master in public law from the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, and he is a senior lawyer for the Northern America. And finally, we have Renata Terrazas Tapia. Renata has a major in political sciences by the National Autonomous University in Mexico. She also has a master's degree from Berkeley, California. She has more than 10 years of research, and she is in San Luis, in Jornada San Luis. And right now she is vice president of Oceana Mexico. Welcome, all of you. We are in this panel to address the topic of climate justice, which is a topic that is more familiar to us. In the last few years, it has become more apparent because climate justice is a concept that is established in an issue of responsibilities and human rights, where starting with the effects of climate change, it has been discovered that usually people that are more affected by these impacts on climate change are those that have the least responsibility in the problem. This means the people that issue the least amount of greenhouse gases are the ones that suffer the greatest consequences. And therefore, climate justice addresses a great amount of principles and components. And its objective is, on one side, to make the greatest companies or governments that are responsible for this accountable, and on the other hand, try to avoid this creation of greenhouse gases, and also to pay for the damages and the losses that come from climate change, especially in those places and production areas that, as I mentioned, contribute less to this problem. Now, having this context, what we are going to do in this panel is analyze how climate justice is in our country from different sectors and the expertise of our speakers. And for that, I would like to give the floor to Renata, who first of all is going to introduce a case on how a specific center, which is fishing, they are living these differentiated effects of climate change so that we can continue with our ideas with Celeste and Froilan on how we should move forward or improve access to justice in order to reach climate justice. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Renata. Thank you, Anaí, and thank you for the invitation to Mexico Evalúa. I am going to present. This is a very specific case. Sometimes we think in climate justice and we think of courts, and we need to see what is behind, who is telling this story and what it means. The climate crisis has very specific effects in the ocean. It destroys complete habitats. It ends with the life of marine animals. And there's something that we need to remember is that there are human beings that are in the first line of the effects of this climate crisis. I would like to talk about people who dedicate to fishing. We have been working in different campaigns, and we are trying to tackle what we can control in an almost immediate way, such as pollution, fishing, the destruction of habitats in a very specific way. But there is also the white elephant on the room every time we're having these discussions, which is the changes in temperature and the acidification of oceans that has an effect as well. And in the end of the day, all of these have a common component. It is human beings who are in the center of this discussion. We are the ones who have generated this, who can transform it, but we are also living the effects in a very specific way. We are all suffering from this climate crisis, but we are not suffering it in the same way. And it's very important to understand that when we think about justice and environment, these are hand to hand. The effects are not the same for everyone, and therefore responses should not be the same. In the specific case of fisheries, in this case in Mexico, we have the largest component that, as you can see, is the maximum sustainable yield. This means that we are getting what is just enough for the people of that, for the population of that species to be maintained. But this does not consider climate crisis or changes of temperature, currents, or anything else. The light blue part, we have damage, and 7% with other status, which we don't know what it is. When we add up this 63 and 17%, we have 80% of our fisheries in damage or about to be damaged, because the climate crisis, what it's going to do, it's going to modify the situations in which we have done the calculations for these fisheries. So we have this really large percentage that is not affecting in the same way, not even to the people that dedicate to fishing. In Oceana, we developed a social map of fishing that shows how many human beings are behind each of these fisheries, and how to think that maybe one of these fisheries that are being damaged have different effects. We may see some of the fish here, or shrimp, which is one of the largest populations of fish that are being used and that have a greatest impact in the lives of fishers. This is another way of seeing the same data, in which we can see the percentage of people that dedicate to it, but also the situation in which they are, the situation in which they are in this deterioration of the fisheries. And all of this shows us a very specific impact in some fishers above others. This map, what it means is that where we have more fishers and where the poorest fishers are, there's where we see this immediate effect in the fisheries. And those who are just months away or a few years away from losing their livelihood for their families. This is just an example. Sometimes we believe in fissures and we think about the climate and oceans and its importance, and then we think about fissures as the enemies of oceans. And there are different nuances for all this story. This is the specific case of Edgar, a fisher in Mazatlan. What you can see in that photograph is what he could fish in one day. This is a very specific fishing that he could do, and that's what he needs to sell to live throughout the day. That's what he's facing with climate change or with storms. When this happens, he needs to stop fishing and he doesn't have this income for himself and for his family. So these people with this fishery, which is very selective and has very few effect in habitats and in the ocean, we are putting them in the same basket of this industry fishing that may have more damaging effects for the ocean. However, they are going to receive the greatest impacts of the climate crisis and everything that is happening in the ocean. If you want to know more, there's this event tomorrow at 11 a.m. It's going to be a relationship between the climate crisis and fishing in order to understand how we are not considering this climate crisis and its effects in fisheries. Now, just quickly, how would climate justice would look like in oceans? We do not need to wait for there to be damaging acts for the ocean in order to enable public policies and the justice systems. There are a lot of steps that we can do before that. What leads many fishers to overfish is not the need to destroy the ocean, but it's a need of social and living situations that are not optimal for them. We need to consider them to be subject of rights. We need to address that in a wider way, and not only from fishing. They need to have access to education, social security, health, etc. And we need to understand that there is not a problem on climate crisis with this punitive side. There are a lot of things that we need to do before the disaster happens. And the second thing is that we need to consider the information of this climate crisis within our own responses as a state. When we find topics such as what is happening in the ocean, who are the communities that are in the coasts, the fisher communities who are going to be the most affected. And we should not forget that the climate crisis is in the core of the people, and some people are above others. We're not all in the same boat. Unfortunately, the effects of the climate crisis are different, and also the actions of the states are unequal to face this climate crisis. The invitation is to act according to who is receiving the greatest impacts. And as Anaí mentioned, these are usually the people that are contributing the least to this climate crisis. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you, Renata. Without a question, this was a very practical presentation on how today these effects can be seen in a specific context in our country, considering the coast that we have and the great amount that we see in this and that live from this activity. And you also mentioned some elements that, from your perspective, what should be considered in this climate justice from judicial elements, talking about sanctions and impunity, as well as accountability, but also important elements in the economy and in society that should be considered in the construction of this justice element. And to go a little bit deeper into what justice means and what are the challenges, and also how it can be addressed by putting it into this climate justice topic, Dr. Celeste is going to share her presentation and her remarks. And I would like to remind everyone that in the end, we have a Q&A session so that you may think of your questions and you write them down. And with no further comments, Dr. Celeste, the floor is yours. Thank you, Anaid. I don't know if you are going to do the presentation or I can share my screen. We have it. Do you have it there? I think you can see it now, right? Yes, we can see it now. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm very glad to be here with you. For us, it's very important to share a little bit these reflections on a topic that is more and more important, which is environmental justice. We are living in a new geological age, according to new studies that were recently published. Many of them tell us that we are reaching the Anthropocene, which is a new geological age, and this presents important challenges for all of us. And I think that the case that Renata is mentioning shows us the implications of environmental justice in a case study, which is related to fishing. And this is a topic that we need to see in detail because this concept of environmental justice is subject to definition issues. And we can understand environmental justice as a distribution of loads or benefits and responsibilities that are related to the access to resources or natural goods and specific laws to regulate the use and access, as well as to repair the damages that the social and economical activities cause to the environment. And this is just a general way to understand environmental justice. However, this same concept is going to have 4 perspectives. Each of them is very complex and very discussed. So what would we understand by justice and how does it combine with the environmental problems? From a legal standpoint, we need to be very clear that the person that breaks the law is committing a crime against justice. But how can this be related to the environment? It seems that these are 2 completely different things that cannot be related. In the second place, how do we interpret this relationship from the public policies that we can design, precisely to be able to maintain this balance between people and nature? The third perspective that we can identify here is that the definitions and the limits that are established usually by environmental law and the historical and political context, it has a series of demands that are difficult to complement. And what I mentioned, the disruption of the Anthropocene, this new geological age that demands that we take into account these examples that Renata was mentioning, this way of visualizing and seeing people that depend on a resource and how to achieve more sustainable perspectives. We can identify some types of environmental justice. The first one, I would relate it to environmental law. We can talk about access to environmental justice, and this is related to the use of laws or regulations to prioritize the regulation of the use and access to natural resources. This is the type of justice that we can identify, and that is related to the application, to the enforcement of law, and also to apply a series of sanctions for those who do not comply with these laws. The second type of justice is a little bit wider. We are talking about a social and environmental justice, which is related to acknowledging that people have a right to the use of natural resources beyond what is established in the law. And this is an approach that has had more importance in the last few years, from the 70s till today. It has been acknowledged that there are collective actions and that there are people that are using these resources and not necessarily the laws are being complied with. And we need to consider that this represents a more substantive approach, and we may understand as social and environmental crimes those that are not classified or recognized by this. And a third type of justice, maybe it's more related with the climate emergency that we are living. And from there, we may identify other types of justice that are related to climate litigation, climate justice, and retributive climate justice, which is also related to the fact that the countries should contribute to this climate change issue. And also, I would like to say that the approach of environmental law requires the constant update of the legislations and the criminal codes, but also there are a lot of damages and risks that are related to nature, and many of these damages are not repairable. And environmental justice has a lot of community and social applications related to nature, but it requires for it to be translated in legal mechanisms in order to diminish or decrease the environmental effects. And also climate justice depends on the ways these are implemented in the national legislations. This would be my contribution right now. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Celeste. You have given us very important ideas on how we should consider this concept of justice from different areas. And one of them is more related to climate justice, which is related to equity and the distribution of these loads, besides the access to natural resources. And maybe to finish this first round with Froilán, having heard the case study that Renata mentioned, and also with the theoretical part and the challenges of how to comply with justice, maybe Froilán can create a reflection of what would be the mechanisms so that communities that depend on natural resources may have access to this environmental justice, and in a very specific way to climate justice. So what would be these tools or the mechanisms that you think that should exist? Or if they already exist, what are the challenges for them to be effective so that they can have access to this justice? I mean, the most vulnerable populations can have access to it.
Thank
you very much, Anaid. The main mechanism that we have seen in recent years and that is promoted in the most recent COP meeting is for them to be included in the decision-making processes. It may seem logic, but we're full of clear examples that this is not being done. One of them was a case in Houston in 1979, where it is said that the concept of environmental justice was born. And lawyer Robert Bullard I'm sorry, could you hear me? Yes, the last 20 seconds you just muted. Okay, this lawyer was acknowledged as the father of environmental justice. He led a series of trials against the city of Houston because they were going to put a new landfill. And what they saw is that in that city, more than 82% of the landfills that were built in the last 100 years had been focused on areas where there were mainly African-American population, and only 25% of the population was African-American. So it was a very important concentration. This was a very known case. And even though they lost that trial, and it was possible to see the relevance of the analysis, and most of the decision-making processes that were done here was because of governments that were mainly represented by white population in that moment in Houston. And in different interviews, Robert Bullard also explained that, in his opinion, that was the main objective. And the second example is also related to the organizations of environmental preservation. The Nature Conservancy is an organization that has been around for more than 65 years. We have promoted the creation of different national parks all over the world for many years. And well, the creation of these national parks did not involve works with the communities that could live there, and they had restrictions on the practices that they could have without asking for consent and restricting their ways of life, or they could also buy their lands. And many national parks did not have the proper management that was expected from them because the local communities were never involved in this. So we have promoted different changes. For instance, in Canada, the most recent national park was created last year. It's 6 million acres. And in this case, its creation was along with the local communities, and they are going to be co-managing this park. And something that is actually relevant is that acknowledges the connection that these communities have with nature, and that they are communities that appreciate what nature gives them. And usually these are the greatest protectors of the resources that they have. So that would be the main mechanism that I would promote. And the second type of mechanism that I consider to be important is that the assessments done by the different governments on the works that may have an impact on the communities are assessed in a comprehensive way on the regions where they live. And there's also a recent example from 2019 that got to the Supreme Court in Chile from the Valparaiso area, where it was an area that in the last 20 years, they had a lot of growth. There were a lot of licenses authorized for the different types of industries, and all those industries were complying with the regulations. They were not breaking any environmental laws. When they went to the environmental authorities, they complied with everything. However, the level of growth was such that in 2018, the cases of asthma in the city started to grow significantly. There were also more than 300 people that were suffering from something in the city, and they did not know why. And one of the reflections that they did from these cases that they could not know who was responsible from authorizing all these works, and these were authorized in individual aspects. And one of the aspects that the Supreme Court promoted was to do a comprehensive assessment on how the different works that were impacting the communities were going to have a joint impact, and then start from that. Those would be the two mechanisms that I would propose. Thank you very much, Froilan. It was also very interesting because you are giving an element that goes beyond the law and that also calls for politics. And I mean, we are building and doing public policies so that these communities are considered from the construction of policies that many times from the implementation can violate the rights from the communities, starting by ignoring them as the people that are benefiting or being affected by this. And there are many cases that, for instance, the installation or the creation of wind parks or these renewable energy projects that are promoting the mitigation, they were being implemented without the consent of the indigenous communities. So while they are trying to solve a problem, which is the mitigation of greenhouse gases, they are creating social and environmental conflicts. And that's the point where this principle of social participation has been considered, not only as an initiative, but also in the construction of different policies. And also something very valuable that you mentioned is how these instruments of environmental policies right now in the protected areas and the assessments of environmental impact from its creation, but also for its application, can contribute to create justice or injustice, in this case, related to climate. And as you mentioned, even with the strict compliance of law, many times you can create damages at a middle and long term. And there is also a very important principle that is very relevant in climate change, which is provisional remedies. And because we don't know what is going to happen, we need to have a moderate risk management, because there are a lot of effects that we cannot foresee. Thank you very much for this first round. And I would like to introduce the second round, having heard your previous interventions. And I think that we have some common elements.
We agree that we have here a social component, which is pivotal, and we cannot therefore ignore this social component, which generally is the societies or the most vulnerable communities, structurally speaking. And these are the ones that will have the greatest impacts because of the climate changes. Therefore, we need to pay attention to a justice concept that goes beyond lawfulness. And we will have to think about the construction of policies, not just of laws, but policies including these communities. And we must take effects into consideration in the short and long terms. For an intergenerational principle, which is how we were given this planet and how we're going to be giving it in return. I will ask now for this next intervention, how could we measure environmental justice and climate justice, and who has therefore the authorized voice to say what's just and what is not? Is it a law, a judge, the affected community, the state? Is the state that has to rule the creation of human rights and control them? So based on your expertise and on what you have just shared with us, I would like you to answer this question. How could we say that we are advancing in terms of environmental justice? What are the elements would be, and who is going to define what justice is? Who is the authorized voice, or is it many voices actually? So you have 5 minutes to answer to this question. Would you like to start as we did the first round, or would you want me to choose? Okay, go ahead, Celeste. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. I can tell you a little bit about what we're doing from the Las Americas University Puebla, which is a proposal for the measurement of environmental justice. I would like to have my presentation shared on the screen, please. There we go. Thank you. This is an index we just presented in April 2020, and it aims at measuring environmental impunity. This stems from a very broad exercise that started in 2014 at the university. And just a couple of years ago, we started to build it for the environmental field. We are a group of professors and university researchers, together with talented students because of their interest in research. We presented this index, and I think that this is going to take several of the elements that about which Renata and Freelan just told us. And in here, we have to consider the social aspect in the measurement of environmental justice. We understand environmental impunity, the impossibility to prosecute, sanction, and repair crimes and damages against the environment. This is the type of justice about which I was speaking at the beginning of my presentation, the absence of application or enforcement of environmental public policies, and then analyzing the state's powers to achieve and materialize those climate and environment goals. And the respect of a healthy, of the right to a healthy environment. That's the way that in which the United Nations has defined it. And the existence of public policies in the long term. This concern that is being taken from different sectors and the need for these to be long-term planned. We have to have intergenerational actions that retribute to the next generations, so we can give them a better environment. This is the more general concept of the index. We measured several capacities, the institutional capacity at the state level, at the federal state level, because we analyzed each of the Mexican states, the environmental aspect concerning murders of activists, and everything related to this dimension, the environmental degradation, deforestation, and in here we are considering other indices as well of natural capital, and their intergenerational strategy that concerns or revolves around the existence of legislation considering future generations, climate change, and biodiversity loss. We analyzed all of this with 42 indicators. This was complex, you can tell, and we needed uniform information for all of these dimensions of all of the Mexican states. Mexico has made good progress to measure somehow the environment aspect at the domestic level, but it is still missing capacities to measure this at the state, at the country level. We use the green criminology aspect, perspective, the approaches we were just mentioning, and this concerns the social and environmental justice. And we found this map of environmental impunity in each of the Mexican states. And unfortunately, we have an average of 1.93, which is the domestic average, and very few states, around 9 states, are above the 2-point rate. Each one of these 4 dimensions is worth 1 point. So very few states, only 10, are above the 2-point rate, and 1.93 is the domestic average. So in these 4 dimensions we're analyzing, we have a very poor rates at the Mexican level, at the Mexican states level, and we should be able to discuss this at the same level. Next one, please. I'm sure that I have used most of my time. So we have there the results per Mexican state. Durango, Morelos, Baja California, Querétaro have the best results, and the words Colima, Sinaloa, Tlaxcala, Zacatecas, the states which have a way lower level results per dimension. The next one. The next one. The next one again. So I don't use more time. Next one, please. In here, I would like to tell that we need better capacities for all the Mexican states, budgets, resources to have a better measurement for this index. We have statistical information for the environment, which is unequal throughout the country. We need an indicator that measures domestically justice, environmental justice, rights. It's important to develop these capacities at the government. This statistical information must allow to measure conflict and environmental victims. It's important to develop a state assessment system. It's not enough knowing that there are laws against climate change and for the protection of biodiversity. There must be effectiveness in the application of these programs in the state. Of course, we need, because of this global environmental crisis discussed at different international fora, and that has kept us for almost 2 years now locked down at home. We have to consider the human rights at the environmental level, and we have to acknowledge the most vulnerable populations faced to the climate change problem. Thank you very much. That would be what we're doing, and I think this can contribute to the analysis or the measurement of environmental justice. This is a thorough methodology to measure somewhat abstract concept and materialize it with these 4 variables. A very good contribution indeed. Renata, the floor is yours. Thank you, Anaid. When one thinks about justice, there are always several components. One possibility here is punishment, who pollute, who is damaging everything. And on the other hand, we have to think who are being affected the most and at which extent. For the part of who polluted, it's rather punitive in Mexico than justice in Asia. The justice system goes for what's easier to process, to stop. I will never forget when I read a story of a person who had been 8 years in the prison because he had killed 2 rabbits in a national protected area, and then a company that paid a tiny part of its income after having polluted water bodies. So we have a distinction here. Before we go into the topic, we're going to have a distinction. And we have a trend to punish more fully the actions that are having a dominant impact on the environment. When we speak about environment justice, I think about, I rather think about the people who are more affected, and we have justice in this and other COP26. We haven't been able to to control emissions. It's a topic that it's there as if it did not exist, and we have several challenges here. For this part, those who are affected the most, I think that we have a specific concern. It's the creation of public policies. I am a politologist, and I think we need a proposal for this before we even try to bring people to justice, given the problems we have in Mexico in terms of access to justice. However, there is a challenge here, and even if when I have just said this, there is a challenge for the justice system in terms of climate crisis. It's almost impossible unless we have a direct relationship, unless we can prove how we have a direct impact on people's health. Otherwise, it's very difficult to have this to establish this cause that has to be very evident for everyone to see how an action determines an environmental consequence, which is the line of thought of judges. And Mexico and the world must adapt to this way to understand causality in a more comprehensive way. For example, we're speaking about this in the case of Chile. We did not know what the company was responsible for this impact, and this happens a lot in terms of access to justice. The response by the state sometimes is going to create these inequalities itself. You mentioned it, Anna, is with the air turbines. So it's a matter of full communities of people, of indigenous peoples, but there are other approaches by the state in which we do have some impact that could reverse the negative effects on the most vulnerable populations. A specific example would be renewable energies, which do empower that make power electricity more expensive. But those who have a bet on renewable have subsidized populations at a great level of vulnerability. For the transition of, to these energies do not absorb this change. So it's true that sometimes we have to move towards polluting less, which is going to have immediate effects in the people's economies. But that's why the studies are there for them to have this greater impact. And there was a specific question, how to make these decisions. I think we have all to be at the table of discussions. We will be making a mistake whether we consider environmental or climate justice depends on experts, on judges, and only on the governments and the organizations. We need to have broader conversations between different people. And I think that the principle that on which we should agree very soon is that the affected people have to be at the center of discussions. We're going to take an action to solve a problem. People who are going to be directly affected by that have to be at the center, wherever and about whatever. So we have to start doing this genuinely, so we can get to more virtuous actions in terms of climate and social and environmental justice. Thank you very much, Renata. Without a doubt, we have to place the most affected ones at the center, so we can say what's fair and what is not fair. That would be the best. In the case of a country, at the Congress, sometimes we have abstract laws that do not have the social foundation, or they lack knowledge of the reality. Thank you very much. And to close this block and then to move to the other questions we have from the public, I would like to listen to Froilan and his reflection. Thank you very much, Anaim. We have to think about measurements and where the voices of these measurements should be. Celeste made already an identification of the main ones. One that I would like to highlight is that planning models have to include these variables. For instance, 7 years ago, CBE in Coatzacoalcos River, which is a dam-free river, which is one of the longest rivers that still flows freely. There were plans to create new dams for the next 40 years. 14 dams that were going to generate over 80% of power and electricity generation. For these initial models, when we started to consider, what they started to consider where those dams would be, we were not considering deeply the environmental impacts, nor which communities would be affected. What happened? There was a collaboration with the Inter-American Bank of Development, with organizations, with the direction, with the Nature Conservancy to conduct models of how we could have a better planning for the river that respect the needs and meet the needs of power. But at the first time, and at the first stage, we'll consider the environmental impacts. And here we had these models and how we could minimize at 90% of the natural impacts and only with 5 dams. And how can we, why not include more variables? That's what we said. So we need further studies, but from the beginning, this allows to see how we can achieve these. And finally, the last model that was pre-approved, because these are very long-term plannings. We only had 4 dams, but they were not going to include community mobilization. At the beginning, we were to have 5, and this is going to reduce a lot the environmental impact. I think that an important measurement and an indicator, and we need indicators that let us know that we are living this. With regards to the voices that should measure it, I think it should be everyone. And this is something that we should have, and we should do it. Almost nobody is doing this. And in general, with climate change, we have a lot of surveys, at least here in the United States. Only 50% of people think that some impacts will have some impact in their lives, when actually maybe they're even suffering this. But out of that 50%, around 20%, well, we're having only 30% are having discussions around this of impacts, and in terms of what we could do. If we do not speak about these topics, how are we going to take actions for the type of measurements that we need to correct them? And well, that's why I would like to thank Mexico Evalúa for organizing this room that allows to have this type of conversations, so we can speak more about these topics. And these are topics that sometimes, with the examples we're given, we could think, okay, the Coatzacoalcos River is very far away, and the high latitudes of another area are so far away. But this is also getting to urban areas, and we can think about where we can reach the main environmental benefits. For instance, in a city in which in a city where we have the best sport and green areas, if you want to make exercise and be healthy, we saw the relevance of this with this year and a half of a pandemic to have a good condition, a good physical condition. Also, where we have the impacts, where we have the landfills of your city, and several indicators that can take you to say, okay, how is the city in which we live, and how can we assess whether this is a fair in environmental terms. Thank you very much, Florian, for your example of this centrals. When we try to solve a problem, and also when the ecosystem where we'll have this climate solutions, we're going to generate a greater problem, the one that we're trying to solve, and several parallel problems that we have to be dealing with. And from the conception of these public policies, in these projects we need to take them into account. This is going to help, and of course, the system of punishment and accountability is very important, and the role of the judges as well. A lot has been said by the judiciaries of through the courts of all countries, for instance, hydrological justice with regards to climate justice. But if we all have something to say about it, I think that we all build this climate justice. And having said this, just a couple of questions. I hope we can answer them, one of which is, what's the role and the responsibility for companies we speak about corporate accountability, but we have no transparency for business operators. We're going to give 1 minute to answer this because we are running out of time. And the second question would be whether you identify any type of community effort from the populations living from natural resources to achieve access to justice and to balance the role and responsibility for businesses. That's the first question. I would like to listen to each one of you for a minute, and then we will go to the second question. Or if you prefer, one can answer this question, or the three can answer this question as you prefer. Okay, I can answer. I'm going to share my point of view with you. With regards to the role of the businesses in this problem of justice, I think it's pivotal. For instance, in the case of Puebla, a very polluted river that you may know, the Atoyac River, which is the second most polluted river of the country. And in spite of the endeavors and the work of NGOs, so we can rescue this river, there is coordination is still missing between the Mexican states, and one of the problems that we have and that we haven't been able to solve in spite of so many years of attempts. The legislation for businesses and for power plants and for them to perform efficiently, for me, it's like the closest example I have to the place where I live and where, unfortunately, we haven't been able. I mean, the company's role is important because we have several textile industries that pollute the river because of the chemicals they use, and we need a deep regulation here, but not just companies. We also have residential buildings whose wastewater goes directly to the Atoyac River, and these condos have sprawled. And with the different municipality and state levels, we have to work with them as to prevent this problem we have had for several years, and this has not been something successful, unfortunately. Thank you very much, and I think this is very important. I would like to, the role of businesses is very important, but we have to have something clear. They're not going to self-regulate. They will never go against their own economic interests to protect anything. This won't happen. They have to be regulated. We need to work with the business people, and we need to build agreements. Yes, but we have to regulate, and the power that consumers have got is huge. We have been able to transform many things, and they're not going to do this bona fide. They need this boost and to have people pulling in the same direction, and together we have to be vigilant all the time. It's very easy sometimes we see this, these big businesses that increased their huge, they increased their gains, and then they're giving they earned millions, billions, and now they're just giving millions to solve any environmental problems. And there are cases in which communities are organizing. This is different, and here we see that we have an immediate affectation, and if they don't do anything, and if they wait for states to act, in the case of fishing, there are communities that they have seen that the resource deteriorates, and they organize so they can restore, repopulate, and have a self-imposed non-hunting or fishing periods, even when they do not have the mechanisms of support. I am a fan of Ostrom. There are big examples for which people themselves are organizing, and in a community way they are managing resources in a 1,000 ways better than others. So we have this happening in small points, and we have to scale this up and bring it to a level in which people are at the center, make decisions, and for which there is a principle to preserve their natural resource of which they are taking their livelihood. Thank you very much, Renata Freeline. You've got 1 minute. Thank you. I think about the second question. I would like to recommend, in case you want to know more about community-led projects in Mexico. We've got several examples, but I would like to highlight the Territory Integration Centers. It is Spanish acronym, and these are unions of different community land owners focused on how they can better manage the natural resources and how they can have a greater capacity to face the climate change consequences. Actually, we've had 4 successful success cases that were presented in our COP, and through the development management, Chairperson Oaxaca receiving this support from the United States for this type of projects, and this is going to be channeling through the Nature Conservancy to support community initiatives in these states. Thank you very much, Froilan. Well, thank you to our panelists. We have more questions that we will be sending you through the chat. And also, you can send your answers to the organizers so they can send them in turn to the public. Thank you for this short but very rich exchange of ideas, experiences, and reflections. And I will invite the public to continue with us for the next panels of the Justice Innovation Forum. And I will remind you that tomorrow we will we'll be here again. Thank you very much, and greetings, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.